Hey guys, welcome back to the Outpost. Today we're going to continue our TacMed series. We're going to be talking about wound packing and transitional areas or junctions, depending on what you want to call them. We're continuing with our March series, our March algorithm for tactical med. Remembering March is massive bleeding, airway, respirations, circulation, and then head injuries and hypothermia. We're still in the M area. We talked about massive bleeding, tourniquets. The other area that we're going to talk about is the wound packing and how that can address a massive bleed in a junctional or transitional area. That's going to be a spot where a tourniquet doesn't work. Like a tourniquet will work on the arms and the legs, but you have got your transition areas, like your armpit, your groin, or your pelvic girdle, where you can't get a tourniquet to work. Anything like that. Remembering that you never going to introduce anything into the thoracic cavity or the box, which is from your belly button all the way to your collarbone. Anything that's going to go inside that, you don't ever want to put gauze in. One of the big principles here is that this is still for a massive bleed situation. So not a road rash or a little scrape, but we're trying to go down inside the body and find a massive bleed and stop that from happening, because that massive bleed is a major life threat. We'll draw a little picture here in a second, but we've got a major vessel, a artery or vein that's been ruptured, and a lot of blood is coming out of it. We need to occlude or stop the bleeding at that point. Like normally you can stick your finger down in there and squish the blood vessel up against a bone, as an example. But now we want to get our fingers back. So we are going to pack that cavity, that wound cavity, with gauze or something that's going to pack very easily, like clothing. Gauze works really well in the medical world, so that we can put that pressure on that blood vessel up against something hard like a bone, which is where these major vessels typically run, and then seal that wound back up with that bleeding stopped. So it's kind of a complicated procedure. Honestly, I feel like the more live tissue you can get, the better, but we've got a training dummy I'll show you here that you guys can set up yourselves if you want to practice as well. A very important skill to learn, especially transitional areas. This could also be applied, let us say we put a tourniquet on somebody. We're going to do a long transport. They've got a massive bleed in their arm or their leg that's been controlled by that tourniquet, but we want to put a pressure dressing or pack the wound of the actual site of the injury as well, so that we're doubly certain that we're not going to be having it start to bleed again. Okay, all of you have probably seen somebody shoot into ballistic gelatin on a video. Bullet coming in, a massive cavity is created. You see that it'll expand out and then collapse back down, where all that disrupted tissue happened when a high-speed projectile enters into flesh. Where this massive cavity is, that's going to be your wound cavity there, and not where it collapses back down, but that whole cavity created then needs to be filled in. Let us say we've got a bone and a vessel in there. Use our imagination if we can. We've got a bone and a blood vessel. We're going to put our finger into the hole and push this blood vessel that's ruptured up against the bone, trying to stop the bleed. Now, to put pressure on that one little point where our finger was, we need to fill this entire space with something so that that pressure will be maintained there. That's why you want to use something soft and flexible. Gauze or fabric works extremely well, and to fill in that hole. And then when you seal off both ends, if it's an in and out wound, then you're going to have that pressure maintained and a clot can form. All right, I'm going to introduce you to Lieutenant Lumpy, our training dummy. Dummy's fitting because he's a lieutenant. This is a jiu-jitsu dummy. that we're going to use for our medical training here. Got to get reps in. You want to get good at something. We're going to simulate that he's got a wound here. So we've got a piece of foam that's been taped and co-band to the outside of it so we don't actually ruin our training dummy. So you're going to have to use your imagination that none of this other bandage and stuff is actually here. But where are you going to put a bandage, or where are your transitional areas? We're teaching, young dumb warfighters, you can say sacks and cracks. So ball sack, butt crack, but it's going to be your junctions where I can't get a tourniquet any higher than here or here, but there's still this area that's going to be your pelvic girdle. Remember, your navel or your belly button, thereabouts, to your collarbone, and anything that's actually going inside the thoracic cavity, which is your chest, you don't ever want to introduce anything to, because that's going to cause more problems than it'll ever solve. Also, if you're trying to put something in there to pack it all the way tight, the lungs won't work. We'll go over that in the future here. Well, we're going to simulate that Lieutenant Lumpy here has gone and hurt himself. Now we're in a tactical field care phase, and we've moved ourselves off the X, scene safe, and all that. We're going to put our finger in the hole, and we're going to try and find what a source that bleed is. You may have to actually physically open up this hole, ripping it with your fingers a little bit. Only had to do this once or twice. It's pretty gnarly if you actually do it. But if you can't get to the source of the bleed and stop the bleeding, then they're going to die. So you have to get to where the source of the bleed is. You're probably going to, if it's actually gushing a lot of blood, you're going to have to scoop stuff out, chunks of meat, bone, perhaps, and blood. Super gnarly. You probably want to wear gloves, but you're going to have blood all the way over everything when you're done at the end anyways. You're going to use Lieutenant Lumpy's first aid kit, not your own. That's why it's an IFAC, an individual first aid kit. In my training one here, my rolled gauze is already out. You're going to use your combat gauze. We'll go over that here in a second, or your compression gauze. And I always use the rolled stuff because it's cheaper. And you can either tie a knot or roll a ball in the end because you're looking for focal pressure. I'll usually open this up. That way I've got it out. And I'm going to ride this piece of gauze over the top of my finger down to where that point of bleed is, assuming this is inside. And I'm going to replace the pressure with constant pressure. I'm going to go all the way down and in. And then you're going to take a little bit more gauze and you're going to continuously fill in this space. And packing every nook and cranny that you can get. This is a slow, tedious process. And it's super important that you get everything though. If you do all this work, but you can't actually get it firmly packed in there where a good clot will form, the second you try and move them, or if you move them too soon, you're going to end up blowing everything out and having to start over again. When you're doing this on live tissue, which is either somebody who's actually hurt, or if you're fortunate enough ever to go to a lab where they train on animals under anesthesia, you're going to find that pressure time is super important. So you're going to have constant pressure on this wound. 5 minutes seems like the golden minimum. If you're using like a combat gauze or something like that, I've never used the Celox that the Army has, but the combat gauze, you can maybe decrease that time down to about 3 minutes. And as you can see, this is a super slow process. And let's say you get all the way to the end and you still need more gauze. You're going to take and try your best to pull out another chunk, tie the ends together, and keep on working. Because you want to keep that one big chunk so that the surgeon pulls everything out. Worst case scenario, you could probably shove something else in there, looks like a t-shirt. I've heard, depending on the soil composition, people put dirt inside wounds on top of the gauze because they still needed to fill in the space, getting pressure, or a large, like a rock the size of a marble over top of it to put more focal pressure. I've never actually tried one of those things in real life, but those are the war stories that you hear in training. So I can't verify that that actually works, but that's what you've heard. I've heard. Let's assume that we've got this thing packed up the whole way. I'm going to ball off everything that's extra. I'm going to put that over the wound. I may even take another piece of gauze and put that over the top. I'm putting more focal pressure down. And then I'm going to put a heel of my hand and the other hand down, and I'm going to get as much pressure on that as I can. I mean, obviously, if the bones are broken, you've got to make sure that you're not causing more harm than good. But you're applying as much pressure as you can and then not moving so that that clot can form. If I get tired, I'm not going to take my hands off and have somebody else come in. I'm going to have somebody else put their hands on top of my hands, and then I can relax my body down. And you're going to wait a full 5 minutes, or if you've got combat gauze or some clotting agent directly on the wound, at least 3. Once that time's up, you're going to now look at it a little bit more closely. You're going to dig out something to secure this wound in place. One of the methods we were taught was you'd actually sew this back in if you're sitting on a long term, but that's kind of out of most people's scope. You can use a ace wrap, awesome piece of kit, duct tape or something like that, or a combat bandage. And you're going to try your best to secure this down in there so that when you do the transport, this stays in place. I'll go around the entire pelvic girdle here. As you can see, this is a time-consuming process, but it's extremely important if we're doing a massive bleed out. Method does work though, and it will stop bleeding. It's one of those things that's really good to practice, especially if you're worried about a massive bleed, because it's more technical than running a tourniquet. The same principle, let's say we've got a tourniquet, we had a massive bleed in this leg down here. We've got our tourniquet applied. We're later in the field care phase. We're going to move this guy though. We're going to pack that wound down low in the leg just the exact same way. That way we can make sure that that thing doesn't start bleeding again. If we're transporting this guy, we've got to carry him, stuff's moving around. If that tourniquet, heaven forbid, blows off, then we're going to have a double backup. So hopefully he doesn't bleed out. So what are some of the tools that we could use for this phase? Your combat gauze. If space is at a premium, I don't carry this. Not because it's not good, but because the compression gauze. So this is the same gauze that I used, just wrapped up in a watertight package. This is more versatile and cheaper than the combat gauze. It does save you about half as much time. And time is at a premium when you're doing trauma care. So it's very good, it's just very expensive, and space-wise, even though this is a small thing, I get more bang for my buck out of this because it's multi-use. You can also use your triangle bandages. That's a good wound packing tool, stuff like that. Real cheap, real simple stuff, but they're very versatile, very useful. Hopefully that was a clear explanation of what we're trying to do here. Big thing is you're trying to pinch the blood vessel off that's causing the major bleed, because that blood vessel's been ruptured itself, and you want to keep as much of that blood inside that person. As always, taking any medical advice from somebody on the internet, contact your doctor and your lawyer and shift all the liability to them. Make sure that you're doing what they recommend that you do, not some guy on the internet like me. I'm only going to share with you what my training experience has been. I think this is a really important skill set to practice if you are worried about going into harm's way and experiencing major trauma. Stuff like this could also apply if you're working with heavy tools and power equipment, stuff like that, chainsaws, anything like that. Any place we could have major wound potential, it's good to have practice doing or taking care of a wound. Getting a training dummy or a partner to practice on is really good. One way you can practice by yourself without a dummy. You can make a wound potential or practice wound with your hand. Pretend that the little finger down there is the vessel that needs to be pinched off. Have your friend, partner, whatever, give you a hand. You go in there and place your pressure on that, and then open up your gauze, and then use that. You can put that on a part of a body as well to make the training more realistic, as opposed to taking a piece of foam and cutting it up and making a wound cavity. You can also practice this with actual chunks of meat. As expensive as stuff is right now, though, I don't think I'd be buying a big slab of meat just to practice on every couple of times I wanted to do this. Those are ways that you can go about practicing this without actually having somebody hurt. Again, super important that you practice this skill set. Much more difficult to do than a tourniquet placement. Hope you learned something today. If you did, please like and subscribe. God bless.